center is going to create several lecture series, and I made a decision with our team to name some of those after people who have made such a difference in this country that and in my life personally. One of the lecture series is going to be named after Attorney Al McShirley, Attorney Roz Pellis, and Attorney Valerie Equivon, who was our first co-director. Al, would you stand up? Al McShirley, civil rights lawyer. Roz Pellis. Roz Pellis in the back, who was the former head of civil rights for the AFL-CIO and an activist, long record. We're going to do a lecture series once every 2 years or so, specifically on the law and moral issues, right? But we're also going to do a lecture series where we're going to focus on state houses and the power of state houses. I'm not sure what we're going to name it yet, but it's going to be named after Milton, Toby, Fitch, and Dan Blue. These two men you see here. You don't understand, and they taught me this early on, you don't understand the Reconstruction after the Civil War without understanding state houses. They both told me, said, don't just read the United States Constitution, but read the state constitution. And before, in fact, there are things in state constitutions that were put there by black and white people working together in fusion coalition that we don't even have in the federal constitution.
Correct. Correct.
All states' rights is not bad. In fact, in the North Carolina Constitution, it literally says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons, this is 1868, Cornell, all persons. And it was a white Congregationalist minister and a black AME Zion preacher that helped put this language in the Constitution. All persons are created equally, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. They augmented the Declaration of Independence and included labor rights in 1868 in a state house. They guaranteed public education to all persons, not all students. They included adults. We don't even have a federal guarantee to public education. But in the state constitution of North Carolina, because of state legislators like these two men, it was placed in the state constitution. In fact, men, at that time it was men, in state legislatures, by 1872 had rewritten every state constitution in the South. And as recent as 2017, 2018, 2019, we were able to use their wisdom to win voting battles today.
Correct.
You hear what I'm saying? They put things in the law, in the state constitution, that we were able to use 150 some years later to beat back extremists today. So we said that if we're going to have a conference on what are the spiritual and moral issues of the presidential election, and particularly in a country where essentially the election is not over until the Electoral College comes in. Everybody should have got that lesson. Did you get that lesson? And in some ways, the Electoral College did what it was designed to do. It's designed that if the people ever put somebody in office, populace, that the oligarch doesn't want, they can undo it through the Electoral College, right? It doesn't matter how many popular votes you have. The election is not over until the Electoral College. And we saw where we had an insurrection trying to stop the counting of what? The Electoral College. So we said, we can't have a discussion about moral and spiritual issues without asking the question about the crucial, critical role of state houses in 2024. Now, Nancy McLean didn't get into it, but in her book, she talks about how one of the goals of extremists is to use state houses to call a constitutional convention. And once the convention is open, everything is on the table. Am I right, Toby?
You're absolutely
If you ever open it, then everything is on the table. I think now there are only 3 states away from having leadership in state houses large enough to call a constitutional convention without going through the people. And that means if you call a constitutional convention, you could debate the 14th Amendment that says all persons, not all citizens, have equal protection under the law. I'm not quoting it exact, but that's the meaning of it. All of that could be on the table. Now, you're looking at history. Sitting before you is, at one time, there had only been 2 African Americans to ever serve as speakers of the House at a state legislature. The first one was Willie Brown. The second one, which nobody expected, was Dan Blue from the South. He was Speaker of the House in a Southern legislature. I want y'all to hear what, and there hadn't been but, there's 7 today, but at that time, there hadn't been but 2 in the entire history of the democracy. Dan Blue from Robeson County, North Carolina Central graduate, Duke graduate, was the first black speaker, second black speaker post-Reconstruction. And at that time, and there was only one black majority whip. Majority leader, excuse me, not whip, that's right, because whip is one that whips the vote, but leader. And it was in the South. And it was Milton, Toby, Fitch, who also, and this is important that you need to know, it also became the Grand Master of Prince Hall Masons. And why you need to know that in North Carolina is because one of the leading legislators during Reconstruction was J.W. Hood, who was an African-American Episcopal Zion preacher, the president of Livingstone College, and the first Grand Master of Prince Hall Mason in North Carolina. I won't go too deep into that here, Toby, but there are things that if I talk, well, I can't talk about all that, but let me say, in the South, you need to understand the connection between white Masons and the Klan and black Masons and freedom. I'll just leave it at that. And the significance that this is major history right here. So today, I want to ask them some questions. Let's start with you, Judge Fitch.
All right.
You served in the legislature, you retired, you wrote laws as a majority leader. You had to hold together black and white people from all different backgrounds, Eastern North Carolina, Western North Carolina. And during the presidential elections, so much of the news ends up being about the race between who's running for president. Sometimes it boils down to 2 candidates, even though you might have 7 candidates. All the news wants to talk about is 2. But help us understand why we cannot get lost and not pay attention to what's happening in state houses, and what role do state houses play in our lives, good and bad. In other words, what is the power in a state house?
I guess, Bishop, thank you for having me here. I've certainly enjoyed being here, and this has been a great conference. It's one, the first, and I hope that there are many more because they are needed. When you ask that question, it begs the answer to come out of the lips of Ronald Reagan, in my opinion. Reagan took another issue, but he talked about a theory called trickle-down. And that trickle-down is exactly what is happening as a part of the playbook politics today. You could almost do away with Washington, D.C. government, because if you look at it from a bank account type situation, they generate the funds. And they send those funds to your locale, your state. And your state then decides how that money is spent with whatever strings may be attached from the federal government, but basically they have the ability to be able to do what they choose to do. So when you talk about Dan Blue being the second only in the history, it is important because at that point in time there had been a takeover from a defective Democrat to unseat a mountain region Democrat to take the job of the speakership.
So your first battle wasn't Republican.
Huh?
You weren't fighting Republicans. When he took over from a defective Democrat.
No.
Okay.
No, the person who did that was Josephus Maverick.
Okay. All right.
And Maverick then realized that it was closing in on him. And that he was not going to be speaker. He tried to do right, so he says, if I'm not going to be the speaker, it'll be whoever y'all pick, Toby, and we had picked Dan. That's why you gotta come to your meetings. Because if you don't come to your meetings, sometimes you get drafted. Oh. And Dan and I have a friendship going back over 50 years.
So he wasn't at the meeting?
No, he wasn't at the meeting. And the meeting was in his home county. So I thought, what a great way to start this off. And so the next thing he knew, he was a part of the Pittsburgh Steelers organization, and he got Mr. Wilson. He got a new quarterback. And that's what we did. And so it made a difference in the life of everybody. The creek rose. Prosperity rose amongst all races of people. And the thing that was so important, when it happened the second time, we now had defective Democrats, so you had to go cut the deal somewhere else. And I was crazy enough to go sit and cut it somewhere else. At that time, I was in good shape. I didn't walk with a crutch, and I could run as fast as I needed to run. Ain't it right, Al? And so we then put it together such that he would be able to come back and run again, and until it caught up with us, and then they decided, no more of this type of thing. Well, numbers, as I've heard throughout this session, controls. And so we took 8 people and controlled the legislature of 170 people by standing in the gap, and they could neither side get a majority unless the 8 of us decided. I had a good friend, still my good friend.
Y'all hear that? Now you're hearing Southern politics at its best.
My best friend, next best friend, was H.M. Mashaw Jr. And one day I told Mickey, if I catch you in the speaker's office again without the rest of us, we're going to have to break your knees. He never went to the speaker's office again.
Y'all, you need to hear what he's saying. That here, let me, because it's important. These 2 guys from the South. You had a white speaker who was a Democrat, who was about to lose with Democrats. The majority was Democrat. This wasn't a Democrat versus Republican battle. That's why I said this morning, you can't put this stuff in little neat boxes, right? This was Democrats had the majority, but they were struggling with who would be the speaker. Toby says, I call him Toby, but Brother Milton Fitch, Brother Judge Fitch says, they cut a deal, they put Dan. Dan is able to coalesce the majority and win. First time, second time in history, first time in the South. Second time around, you have defective Democrats who don't want a black man as speaker, but also a man as speaker and a majority whip who, because of their moral upbringing, would not give the governor line item veto. You know, I remember that, did you, Toby?
Yes, sir.
They, because of what they grew up on in the church, because of what they knew about faith, what they knew about power, they said, this man said, if it costs me I'm not going to give Democrat or Republican governor that much power to line item veto the budget. And so Democrats, some of them, because in our state you have Democrats, like them.
Them, that's right.
And you got to know it by geography because it depends on if they're east of 95 or if they're west of Statesville sometime or out in that area. And they defected, so this man had to cut a deal with Republicans at the time, but not the kind you see today many times, that they could work with without giving up their principles, without giving up their power. Because as he said, the money comes where? To where? The State House. And the classic example of that is what? The Affordable Care Act. It was written in such a way that even though it was a federal opportunity, who could oppose it? The state legislature. So Dan, as Toby's laid out this for us, you were, in the House, and you still are in 2007.
He's in the Senate now.
He's in the Senate now, that's right. But in 2007, when voting rights were expanded and the minimum wage was increased, the Racial Justice Act, well, maybe you talk about those three things that we all did together, the movement and the politics did together in 2007. You were there when that happened, but you also seen the backlash. Talk to us a little bit about what you can do with power in a state legislature, but also what can be undone. Let me tell y'all a quick story about Dan. I was in his committee one day. We were fighting to get a vote to allow state employees to have unions, right? And I had a bunch of activists with me. I don't know if you remember that morning. So I came in the room. We were ready to speak. It's like a hearing. And Dan comes over and folk were like, we're going to tell him what. And Dan pulls me to the side and says, now listen, you can talk or I can carry this vote because people are absent. Now, do you want to make a speech? Or do you want to get this thing out of committee? So I knew when to shut up. But some of the other folk were like, no, we got to say our piece. We got to say our piece. They didn't understand the politics. He had the gavel. And he had the right moral framework. And he was right on the issue. We had done our work. It wasn't necessary to do a speech. What was necessary was for him to gather the meeting into order, call for the vote, pass the vote, get it out of committee, and get it on the floor. But talk to us about what you've seen in terms of what can be done for the good, but also what can be done for the bad.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barber, and
turn his mic up. Hold on a second. Did it? We'll get it somewhere. All right, hold on just a second. Y'all got the best eyes for preachers I ever seen. Y'all can see everything.
I am 3 inches from it, and I can't see it.
Can you hear him now?
With these glasses on, can
y'all hear? Turn it up. Turn it up back there. Say testing one.
Testing. Thank you, Reverend Barber, and like Toby, I appreciate your having us at this inaugural conference. But I want to put something in perspective real quickly. The 10th Amendment, you asked earlier a question about the role that state houses play. You don't hear a lot of discussion on it, but in my first year constitutional law class, I developed an appreciation for the 10th Amendment that was out of character for those of us who were in law school in the 70s. Because we had come, having emerged from civil rights movement, students and stuff, to the belief that all the power came from the federal level, because that's where we, especially in the South, could recognize relief and progress from federal initiatives mostly during that period. But I seized on the 10th Amendment 3-4 weeks in the law school in my constitutional law class. And its wording is something that still inspires me, and you probably know it without knowing all the details, but it says, the power is not delegated to the United States in the Constitution are hereby reserved to the states. That's what it says, plain and simple now. And that concept of federalism, which comes from it, that there are certain powers in the federal government, and all of those that are not specifically set forth remain in the states. Now, that's what the states used from the Civil War through Brown versus Board of Education to maintain, that's the whole mantra of states' rights and all of that stuff. And for 3 different occasions, I headed a group called the National Conference of State Legislatures, which was the spokes body for the 99 state legislatures around the country before the Congress. And when we got together and could agree as to what different issues were really important to the states and which ones we had reserved under the Constitution, we came to do battle with the Congress.
Let me make sure folks heard that. You headed the Council of State Legislators, which had all the legislators, as many of them wanted to be, around the country?
All of them, all
Wow.
99. There are 50 states, 99 legislative bodies, because Nebraska has only one chamber. Their unicameral legislature. But we were set up, and still are. NCSL still does that. But for 3 separate terms, I served as president of that organization. And the major focus of it was to remind the Congress of what states' rights were. And folks looked at me funny during the Rehnquist Court when I chaired the Judiciary Committee of that body, arguing states' rights. You know, I listened to it, interposition and nullification and all of that stuff, but it stuck with me. And so that is why the states are important in this discussion, because all of the issues that we're talking about in this conference, for the most part, are driven by the states, whether it is wages, whether it is the ability to unionize, as you alluded to with the state employees in North Carolina, law enforcement, all of those issues are primarily state issues, and the federal government gets to play a role in it by using sort of a stick and carrot approach. They can give you the money to do these. That's why the states get the money. We have the ability to tax ourselves. That's what distinguishes us from most of the European democracies. We don't have to get it from the central or federal government. We have immense power to tax, and that's what a lot of states do. But we can generate funds that support that position that comes from the 10th Amendment on our own as states. And so when you couple all of that together, the whole issue of education is driven by states. The federal government funds education programs, and if you don't do certain things, in transportation, the same thing. If you don't do certain things like seatbelt laws and things like that, they won't give you the money from the federal government. And many states refuse to take those dollars, just as you witnessed North Carolina, and now only 10 states, we finally passed it this summer, refused to take the federal dollars associated with Medicaid expansion. Billions of dollars over a 10-year period. North Carolina walked away from more than $50 billion because the state legislature would not accept it. There was nothing that the federal government could do about it. The state legislature had total power over these health care decisions. That's why the states are important, and state houses have to be thought about. One last thought, and you know it as well as I do. I heard the presentations this morning, and so after these major plans were put in place to take Congress and to take the state legislatures, you heard the comment this morning that they decided to take state courts and the federal courts. And it's almost been a situation where they've run the boards and taken care of those. North Carolina, we lost our Supreme Court in 2022. But the magic about it, why state houses are important and state bodies, state courts, is that we lost it by 400 votes in an election that was hotly contested. 400 votes out of 7+ million votes cast. I could have gotten those out of one of my precincts, one of my neighborhoods in my precincts easily by organization. But I say that we can't overemphasize it. Now, but you asked me a specific question. When I served as Speaker, we did not have a veto in the government. So what we decided was final. Couldn't be overridden. It was the law of the state. And that's how we started to progress, I think. But first I'll go back. I was one of 4 in the legislature, one of 4 African Americans. Through redistricting, we increased the numbers. So by the time Toby joined us in the House, there ended up being 12 of us. And when I was elected Speaker, there were 12 African Americans out of 120 members of the House. But what we did, and Toby was Majority Leader when I was Speaker, what we did was determine things that not were African American per se, but subscribed to what we said we believed. Voting ought to be a right of everybody once you determine what the basic rules are. So we committed to put things in place so that people could vote. We had early registration for high school students if they were going to turn 18. We started absentee voting, early absentee voting, earlier than usual. We started one-stop voting.
At the state level?
At the state level. Sunday voting, and a multitude of other reasons, other things that made voting available. Because we knew the history of voting in the South. We had our own experiences with coup d'etats in Wilmington that led to the elimination of the only black African American in the United States Congress, the last one to serve from 1900 until 1932, I think, when the priest, one of them was elected in Chicago. And so we live with that history. But so did all of the other folk in our caucus in North Carolina. And so we put in place, by not force, but by reason, things that made it much easier for people to vote, mailing in registrations, and things of that nature. So by 2007, the period that you're talking about, 2008, North Carolina, which had not voted for a Democrat since Jimmy Carter in 1976, voted for a Democrat in 2008 for president, voted for Barack Obama. We didn't do anything funny to the books or anything. We just made the vote more accessible to everybody who was entitled to vote. And over time, we started restoring rights to people who had served their obligation to society so that they could vote, and a multitude of other things that made the ballot accessible. You talk about the issue with the union vote. It was just following what our core beliefs should have been, and I think what they were. That we were just trying to live by the documents that we said inspired us to do what we're supposed to do toward each other.
Bishop,
I'm going to come, make one comment, and I'm going to come right to you. Go ahead, make it.
what he is really saying, so that you can dovetail this with what we've already heard, and that is the fact that not only did we do with legislation, we brought back to the table more African American members. We did redistricting, the same things that they are attacking us for now. We wrote a playbook ourselves that we, the nation, is not following, that's already been written.
It's already been written.
So rather than to try to create, we need to go back and put those things in place that we used to do in order to be, and work it in order to make it work.
And you did that by having a strong group of people who stuck together.
Absolutely, sir.
And you didn't have to worry about one going in the room cutting another deal.
No, sir. No, sir.
And in that way, 12 people could because I want to say in this conference, many of your battles, like your battle to expand same-day registration and early vote, we had the movement in the street and the movement in the suites. In 2007, that then President Obama wins, but he loses on election day. He wins through the early vote same-day registration. But that battle was not a battle between, say, Democrats and Republicans. You had to battle that even in the Democratic caucus.
Yes, sir.
Because it was several years before you all were able to get that through, right?
Right.
And the same thing, tell them about, what was the Racial Justice Act? Tell them about that you all were able to push through.
Well, it was an attempt to rewrite the criminal justice system, which still has not yet been completed. The Republicans have taken over, and they look at a lot of the things that are in the Racial Justice Act, and they want to go the opposite way. We've had people, and one of the people who came to see me and during a Republican administration, it happens to be here at the conference, asking, can't we work a system? I can't now because I'm not there. You know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I got the grease. My district got drawn out from underneath me. So I know exactly what you're talking about from a personal standpoint, but it was giving people a fresh start, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like organizations. You may not be a second chance organization, but there's nothing wrong with giving people a second chance.
And wasn't the Racial Justice Act one of the few in the country where, I want them to hear what it was about. If you were on death row, and you could prove, what was it, that?
I think there were three. Toby was on the bench at that time. The three issues, if you could prove, you were given a hearing in the first place.
Rick.
And initially there was.
So before that, you couldn't even get a hearing?
No, there was broad agreement, even with the district attorneys signing on, that you could get a hearing with a three-judge panel, 3 Superior Court judges, picked by the Chief Justice. You could get a hearing, and after extensive testimony and hearing, if they determined that there was some question about your sentence, your finding of guilt, then the DA had to make a determination as to whether he was going to retry it. Usually by the time you got out of that, all of that done, it was obvious that you were wrongly convicted. And most DAs in it would back off and not rebring the charges. But it was for people who had been convicted of murder. And it was just a review, and all Hades broke loose, quite frankly, once the DAs started switching and saying that there were ways, because they were being proven wrong in a good number of the convictions that they had gotten, having people on death row and other life sentences.
And like so, the one we found down in near where Jesse Ham's county was, Union County, where the DA would hand out gold noose pins, lapel noose pins.
And mind you, Billy, that a former Supreme Court justice who happened to be Republican, after looking at the numbers and the conviction rates, did a reversal and started being supportive of it and helped lead the drive to get it passed, but it became a political issue that folk could get elected on, and so it became a Republican battle cry to do something about letting these people out, even if they were guilty. Yeah. And it has continued still. But anyhow, we got it passed.
That's right.
The first thing they did is repeal it after they took the majority in 2011.
Y'all hit with a moral argument and based in the facts, we're able to get a former Republican judge to join Justice, Supreme Court Justice, not just a judge, a justice, to join in advocating for the Racial Justice Act. Now, it's since been repealed and fought in the court. Now, Dan, you remember that I've got 2 questions for y'all. When we had that meeting with the Catholic bishop, there were Democrats that were scared if they voted for it, they claimed they might not get elected. So Dan organized, I think, Toby, you may have been, I don't know if you were on the bench at that time or what, but organized, I said, Dan, what if I can get the Catholic bishop to come in and we sit down together? And the bishop said, I'll go, but I don't want the TV cameras and all of that. So we were actually able to go in and sit down with Bass Night, Mark Bass Night. Mm-hmm. You remember that meeting? Mm-hmm. Mark Bass Night. He died? He died. He's dead now. And one of the things sometimes the state you can do is to get a leader, like the leader of the Senate, just loose your people. Mm-hmm. It's a tactic I've learned from them. You tell them loose your people. In other words, don't tell them they have to all vote a certain way. Free them up to not have to vote even the party line. And Mark, after he was Catholic, and the bishop said, now, Senator, you know this vote is going to come up again when you face the Lord. Didn't he? That's all he said. He said, you know this vote is going to come up again when you face the Lord. And Mark later told me that really got to him because of some issues were going on in his life, and he was able to pull back, and that vote with Dan and others helped. The minimum wage, in the state, North Carolina, this leadership was the only state in the South to raise the minimum wage. Now, it's not where it ought to be, but this is the power of a state. The last question I want to ask you is one about the presidential election, but this question, both of you can take a shot at it. When the redistricting that was done that wasn't just to elect black folk, it also allowed you to elect more progressive white people and what the extremists did was they bleached black and white and black voters, and you know how they would stack and pack them. So we get this happen in 2010. The United States Department of Justice approves a redistricting plan that all of us were screaming about and saying this is unconstitutional, it's wrong. And this was when Section 5 was in place, but the federal government didn't use it in North Carolina. They actually approved what would later be called an unconstitutionally constituted legislature because of a racially developed redistricting plan. So in 2012, extremists get elected, and they get the first time in history a supermajority of extremists who call themselves Republicans, but they're extremists in the House. Dan and Toby, what did they do? Help folk understand, because a lot of folk think all they did was the voting suppression piece that we ended up taking them to court and winning. But what actually started happening January of 2013 with that new majority in place so that folk here can understand why you cannot ignore these state houses? What started happening?
Thank you, and an appropriate segue. Thank you. You want to do it first?
No, I was going to say that what happened is that all Hades broke loose again. Mm-hmm. And I say it in that fashion because we, through Dan's administration, did redistricting, brought good government back to North Carolina, took care of financing of HBCUs in a fashion that they should have, did all of those things. Public education did well, teachers' salaries did well, but then they started unraveling all of the things that we had done that were progressive things. They started pulling them back, and they pulled them back because they didn't need you. They didn't need your vote, but there was always somebody that was sitting out there ready to take them up on taking care of them, but they knocked the foundation out from underneath everything that you had done, and it's been that way except for the year that we regained a level playing field to some degree whereby they no longer had the supermajority. But as long as they had the supermajority, which they're shooting for again, they don't have to even have you to even come. When I left the bench and went back to the legislature and went to the Senate, all you could do, no disrespect, but all you could do is come to the well of the house and say prayer. And once you said prayer, it was almost like go sit down.
Yeah. Right. Specific, and then end with, if you would, what they actually did to voting rights. Like, it wasn't just one thing. Yeah. But talk some about what in fact were some of the specifics, as Toby has alluded to, that happened. I remember the first hearing I went to was the one on Medicaid expansion. I think they took 17 and a half minutes to say no to 500,000 North Carolinians that would have benefited, 300,000 white, 150-some thousand black, that in 15 minutes, and they would not, one thing I know to remember, they wouldn't allow hearings. They wouldn't even allow the doctors to testify or people who would benefit from Medicaid. In 17 minutes, they said no.
Yeah, let me again put it in perspective, because you talked about, and put it in context.
Turn this up some, bring this mic up, his mic up. Bring his mic up, please.
Can you hear me? I think he just turned it up.
Yeah, he turned it up, yeah.
Can you hear me? Won't get feedback? Okay. You mentioned the Racial Justice Act, and you talk about what they did when they got, after they conducted the elections in 2012. First thing they did was repeal the Racial Justice Act because they didn't want to see that. But as importantly, the decision in the voting arena, as soon as Section 5, actually Section 4, the Voting Rights Act was repealed and Section 5 no longer was applicable to anything, they determined that they would try to roll back the clock on all of these other advances that we had made. First, they wanted to do away with early voting, but their constituency wouldn't let them do that. Everybody was comfortable with early voting 3 weeks before Election Day to start the voting process and over the weekends. And so they couldn't roll that back. But all of the other efforts that we had made with teen registration, and you go down the list. Now, in the meantime, and I have to give due credit to Reverend Barber and the constant efforts. I mean, he was like Muggsy Bogues on a 11-foot basketball player. I mean, everybody remembers Muggsy was about 5'3", and the tallest guy in the world, couldn't do anything because he put the ball down. Every time he would put it down, the Muggsy would take it. Well, the Moral Mondays were like that. They stopped having sessions on Monday because they didn't want to be reminded of what the moral obligations were of us as elected people and what we said we believed in. But among those were the various access to voting decisions that we had made in making it more accessible for the voters. In fact, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals said that bill that they passed was surgically designed to affect black voters, and it was, because we had seen all of these changes over 20 years that had increased. One last thought on that. In 1900, black men outvoted white men in North Carolina. Women couldn't vote. In the election before Jim Crow got firmly established, black male voting percentage was in the upper 80s. In 1902, one session of the General Assembly later, it got down to 0.09%, I think. Totally eliminated in one election cycle. And that's what they had set out to do in the changes that they had tried to implement in the 2012 session. And it took us 4 years to get that reversed through the federal courts. And after that experience, we decided, and rightfully so at the time, to take the challenges against what they were doing to the state court under the state constitution. We have a much broader due process clause in the North Carolina Constitution than that contained in the federal Constitution. And we covered a lot of things, and we had a court that recognized that and overturned their redistricting and overturned many of these other decisions that they had tried to make as a legislature.
State court.
And the state Supreme Court.
Right.
But they flipped that court. And I'll say this. The series of bills that they passed when they were in supermajority status. We had a bathroom bill that embarrassed the state, all right? Telling you which bathroom you could use regardless of which one you felt you were entitled to use. And the business community in the state shamed them into finally changing that, but also we had elected a governor, a Democratic governor. Prior to that time, we had a Republican governor and a Democratic governor who could veto the legislation. So from 2018 through 2022, Governor Cooper, the Democratic governor, vetoed 47 pieces of legislation. we sustained in the Senate all 47 of those vetoes. And they covered a wide range of things, because among the other things that they did, and again, reflecting back to the discussion this morning, they decided that public education wasn't as important as we always thought it was. We had a goal of getting teacher pay up to the national average. We have more nationally certified teachers in North Carolina than any other state because of the importance that we put on education and because our Constitution requires us to do it, at least under the current jurisprudence in the state. And anyhow, so they started cutting public education, not adequately funding it. Article in the News and Observer, my local paper in Raleigh, that now with the tax cuts that you heard about this morning as well, the state has a structural deficit starting in probably 12 to 30 months of over $13 billion that they've cut that they haven't replaced. And an overwhelming majority of that comes out of educational spending. And so we have an historic number of teachers leaving, and the list goes on. So if you look at the things that were vetoed, environmental issues that generally there was consensus on, the governor vetoed their effort to undo that, and we go down the list on things relating to conditions of work, inspecting the safety and plants on farms, and various other things. And again, the important thing is the focus, I think, that you place on our moral imperative. Not just our religious one, those of us who are confessed believers, but what our moral obligations ought to be. And if you look at them, there's just a total turning away from those. So I think that pretty much describes it, some of the specific things.
All of that was because of state legislature. You heard him say, though they didn't have the majority, they were able to sustain the veto. That meant they didn't have enough votes to override. You also heard them say that there was a movement afoot in the state. And their attacking everybody allowed us to organize everybody. Because our mantra was, if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be smart enough to come together. And so they attacked the gay people, they attacked women, they attacked sick folk, they attacked workers. We were able to build all of that into a moral coalition, sustain it for 4 years. The lawyer, one of the lead lawyers in the case that we won, we filed, when they wrote that law to undo voting rights, within 46 or 7 minutes, we were in the court. We had filed. We didn't file 4 weeks later, 2 weeks later. Right. We filed right then and took them to court. Took 4 years. It was people like these folk here that told us where to go look. Said, go look at this question that they asked. They went to the Board of Election and they asked for certain data. And when they said go over there, we went over there, and that's where we found, even though people told us, don't fight so hard, don't try to prove that they did this for racist reason, but the movement said this was racism, and we know it. We can't prove it yet, but we know it. And so what we were able to find was the specific questions that they asked, the data that they asked from the State Board of Election proved that their intent was racist. But then when we filed our suit, we didn't file a black suit. We had black plaintiffs, we had women plaintiffs, we had young folk, we had veterans, we had churches, we showed that the collateral damage of racism, right? I never will forget when a Bush appointee on the courts in South Carolina asked them this question: why is it that you all don't want, well, actually he said, I want to know why y'all don't want nobody to vote. He asked it just like that. I remember the day. And when he asked that, I said, we're going to win this thing. Even he can see. And we had to fight then when others said it was ridiculous. We were the only state to unelect an extremist governor in the South. The only state that put together a coalition in the mountains of North Carolina that sent a Tea Party extremist legislature home who was an incumbent. So as Toby said, the plan, the map for how we do this stuff has been written. It's just a matter of having people believe state by state and building it out and not losing sight of what's going on in these state legislatures. Quick question to Dan and Toby. You all are now, the Center for Public Theology has been asked by MSNBC to host a presidential debate. And they've asked if we would ask Dan Blue and Toby Fitch to be two of the questioners of the president. We got all the presidential candidates, regardless of what they're running. What would your question be in this moment? What do you're rooted in these moral traditions? What would your question, what would you ask them and force them to answer to the whole nation if you were going to lead this presidential debate?
Dan is my leader. I usually follow. No, I'm ready. I would ask the cadre of candidates this question by giving a preamble to it. I would set the story, and I would give history that we come together because we are one of many, and we know what strength is when we come together. We can see it in 9/11, we can see it in all issues of war. But what would you do as the leader of the free world to give every citizen of the United States an opportunity to feel, hear, and know that they are citizens of this great country? In other words, what can you do with your presidency to show that you believe in those documents that were previously written, that we have been living under and living with, and prosperity because of those principles? What can you do to show the American public that you really want to represent us all and truly be the leader of the free world?
Yep. Pretty much along those lines, but with some specifics. I think that, and again, I'm just a country lawyer, but...
Look out, y'all.
No, but the documents that we talked about this morning, the history professor talked about, they come to life. They have meaning. And they've had meaning that threatens people more than they traditionally did since the 1980s, because the picture is getting clearer. It was only after the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act in the 60s and the push of the women's movement at the end of the 60s, early 70s, that we really started moving toward a country that gave those documents real life. I mean, everybody was getting the right to vote. I mentioned to you that it was in after 2000 that we really opened it up. I lived through the 18-year-olds getting the right to vote and all the struggles with that. And so by the mid-'80s, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act started taking effect, for once, those documents, Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence even, started having meaning for more people and the masses of the people. And so the question that I would ask in light of that, since we've gone through this experiment now for less than 50 years in the sense of a broader democracy, is that what would you do in the first 100 days of your administration? Number one, ensure that there are no hungry people except those who are hungry by choice in these United States. Number two, there are no people who don't have health care when they get sick in these United States. And number three, in a real sense, we talk about affordable housing and all the things associated with it. I said homeless people. But those who work hard live by the rules, try to earn a decent living, are earning a decent amount so that they can do those things that you made available for them in this land of milk and honey and opportunity, and that's for everybody in this land. And the answer to that would be pretty instructive as to what kind of 4 years we could expect, and whether somebody is sincere when they answer these questions at fora around the state or the country or the district, wherever they might be running. And I think that would, if they answered those correctly, I'd run out and beat the pavement and do all those things for them.
Can we thank the giant?